Hey, it's Joe West from the West Barn with
Mike Shimshack.
Today, it is our 100th episode. Congratulations.
Wow.
And as a treat to you, we've brought you a good one, Mr. Phill Brown, legendary British rock producer and engineer. He's worked with some of the biggest and most influential names in rock music, including, not excluding, Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Traffic, Bob Marley, David Bowie, Cat Stevens, Talk Talk, Arcadia, and many, many more, countless others. And we are lucky to have him on the podcast. Thank you for being our 100th guest, Mr. Brown.
Thank you for asking me. Yeah, especially on 100.
Right. Yeah, it's important. And we'd like to thank Ken Rose, who put us together, who we just did the podcast with. He said, man, you got to get Phill on.
Lovely guy.
I was doing a little bit of just checking out the internet and seeing, I know that you have an autobiography out called Are We Still Rolling?
Yeah.
So, I saw a lot of that, but I also saw a fascinating interview where you were discussing Stairway to Heaven, which I thought to myself, man, wouldn't it be great if we could just sit here for an hour and talk about Stairway to Heaven? And I'm sure you may have done that once or twice with people. So you'll have to forgive us for, it's only once in a blue moon you get to talk to the person that maybe recorded the biggest rock sound of all time, rock song of all times. But if you don't mind, I'd love to ask you a couple questions about that if you're up for it.
Sure.
I thought a couple things were interesting about that, which one of them being you were sort of relieved to get off the record. You had mentioned that it was a very stressful and laborious task of going into the studio, and that manager dude, Pete, what's his name?
Yeah, Peter Grant.
Was an imposing figure. Tell us a little bit about the dynamic of the session, because we always imagine like, hey, if I were on the biggest song ever recorded, and I was the dude recording that, like it would be this grand thing that would be the reason we all got into it. But it can turn into a bit of a nightmare, and you felt it maybe a little bit. It was a lot of anxiety. Tell us about that session.
Well, I mean, in theory, yes. To work on that, it should be one of the high points in a way. But I knew John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page from Olympic back in 67, 68. They were session guys that had played on loads of people's records. So I knew them from that. But then you fast forward to like early 70s. Peter Grant was quite an imposing figure. I mean, he was 25 stone of, East End muscle. And he just made everything a little unnerving. And although I think I said in the interview, John Paul Jones, absolute sweetheart. Robert Plant, who I've worked with a couple of times since, a gentleman. Bonham just out there, not really. The drums and that had already been recorded, so he was around, but he wasn't actually involved, as it were. But Jimmy Page at that point in time, it was tough. He was pretty dark. He was into his Aleister Crowley, and what with Peter Grant and the Minders in a small room. I was a 22-year-old lackey. They didn't really talk to me that much. I mean, Jimmy Page virtually had no conversation with me at all. He just kept saying again, as we kept doing the guitar solos. So something that should be amazing was actually a very difficult kind of 7-day week of 16-hour days, dropping in on tape on solos and dropping out, catching 4 bars, dropping out, and it's not like today where you have an undo button and you can change everything. This was to tape. So, what you did was what you got. So there was a lot of stress. And Peter Grant, I knew from a year before with Jimmy Page, with Jeff Beck, when I was working with Jeff Beck, and Jeff didn't want to re-sign his contract with Peter Grant, and they stole the tapes from the studio, and then they sent heavies down, and it was, so I had a kind of an insight into that world.
Yeah.
So to walk into the Zeppelin thing, which should have been great, and the band were great. I mean, I'm certainly not criticizing the band, but with Peter Grant and the history that we had, and the kind of aggression that was always just under the surface, and with Jimmy Page, who didn't really talk to me much, apart from saying, again, let's do it again, back to the top again, you know, dropping after 8 bars. It was all very, stressful. So it wasn't the most amazing week of my life, although the track turned out to be fantastic. I appreciate that. But I think that sums up some of the times when you're an engineer or a producer, some of the things you work on that are great fun are failures, you know, and things you work on that are really difficult can be successful. There's no rules.
Right. Did you have any sense during the recording that this was just like one of those things that was going to go on? I mean, you can never anticipate it's going to go on to be the biggest rock song ever. But did it feel like the energy in the room was like, oh my God, we're doing something really special here?
Well, it did feel special, but I mean, it also felt very dark, which again goes against, in a way, the record. But it's very difficult. When I work with Hendrix or Bob Marley, those kind of people that went on to be gods, at the time, they're just, you know, you're in a studio environment. You're not in a gig with 60,000 people. So it's brought down to just 5 or 6 you in a room. And they weren't gods. You know, when I worked with Hendrix, he was obviously successful, but it was early 68, yet to be the god. With Bob Marley on Burning and the Lyceum album, you know, he was slightly successful, you know, in the West, but still not God. And I guess the same with Zeppelin, although they were more gods at that point in time. I saw them in Toronto and they just blew me away. I mean, they were an incredible live band, one of the best rock bands I've ever seen. So I'm not faulting anything of that. It's just that reality of what it's like to work in a studio environment, right, or recording something is not always what it is perceived to be once it's finished. And
right. But did you have a sense that it was like there was some magic? You know, sometimes you're in the room and like, there's something going on here. You had to notice that.
It felt, the thing is, because it was so disjointed, and I think I said in the interview, I have a version of it where everything's out of tune, and so I wouldn't say that I thought this would be this classic, rock anthem that it became, but there was definitely a vibe that felt that this was a bit special. Mm-hmm. But I've always been quite bad at being able to judge some of those things. Working with Hendrix on All Along the Watchtower, it was the most amazing moment of my life. I mean, I still remember it very clearly. And the atmosphere in the room, the sound of it through the tannoys, everything about it was just like, wow, this is incredible. But I still never, realized how big it was going to be. And the same with Bob Marley. I spent a couple of years working with him, and he was special. He was a bit of a prophet, in my opinion, at the time. He had something to say, but I never thought he'd become, as big as he's become, if you know what I mean. It's very difficult when you're just working with people in a room. It is a bit like you and I talking now. We're just, having a conversation, we're creating something. It's very difficult to separate that from things, if it's successful, okay, everyone kind of goes, wow, wouldn't you have known that?
Right. It's very romantic looking back on everything, exactly. Right? If you analyze every moment of it, and it could never be repeated. And
I worked on some things that I thought were just stunning, that were failures, so you never quite know as a producer or an engineer exactly what's going to happen.
Almost 100% of the stuff that Mike and I work on is brilliant in failures.
Yeah.
We don't have the batting at bat record that you have.
I think you always need the freedom to fail. That's
we take it liberally. We apply it generously. We were talking to Tony Platt, about on one of the podcasts about Back in Black, and I want to pose the same question to you, and I don't know that you're even going to be able to answer this because it's such a tough one to have perspective on. When you have worked on the records you've worked on, you just talk about the Hendrix thing and the Bob Marley stuff. You talk about Stairway to Heaven, Zeppelin, and whatnot. Some of the other records you've worked on. Are you able to fully absorb the levity that you were a part of, like insane, this history that is it's royalty history of rock and roll, and it's like, are you able to metabolize that and parse out the part that you're just a regular dude?
I think for me personally, no, it feels like somebody else's life. You know, when I look at all the things I've worked on, you know, I did probably over 300 albums. It just doesn't, you know, it just feels like somebody else's life. I mean, I don't have that kind of sort of ego, arrogance, or whatever to think, oh yeah, that was all down to me. You know what I mean? I was just part of a team that created certain things. But no, it's very hard to look back on the last 50 years. And I just think it's like, wow, that's somebody else's life. You know, it's just like, how did that happen?
You would be unbearable if you didn't do that. You'd be unbearable as a person, because that person, you know, how do you hang out with a dude like that, right?
I was incredibly lucky. You know, I bumped into people on the street that I worked with. I met people in studios. You know, the Talk thing all came about through literally a 15-minute, you know, conversation with Tim Free-Screen that led to 13 years with Mark Hollis. I've been lucky to just be at the right time, right place. And yeah, I mean, obviously there's something I do that people liked, but a lot of the getting in the door was luck.
Yeah. And who would have known that we would still admire music from 50 years ago so much today? And the music we do today, I can guarantee you 50 years from now is not going to be as revered as the music that was captured 50 years ago. It's just because it was true artistry, I think, and it was so human.
The thing is, you know, when I learned at Olympic, it was on 4-track machine, was the kind of Pro Tools of the day. And I worked with engineers that were literally recording, you know, Keith Grant would record a 50-piece orchestra to stereo, mixing and recording as he went. And then, you know, with Dusty Springfield sessions, he'd have 2 tracks left for Dusty to do, you know, a couple of tracks until she was happy. Those guys were genius. I mean, the records, the energy, I think, from that 60s period, I mean, even back to Phil Spector, I suppose, doing it on mono, but there was, you know, lack of technology and making you work a different way, I think, is what creates that magic. You know, 8-track was more convenient. 16-track, hey, we're up and running. 24. Once you get past 24, anyone can, in a way, make a record. And now you've got all the Pro Tools stuff with 100 tracks and people doing it at home. Yeah, we can all make records now. Right. But it lacks, for me personally, it just lacks that energy of 5 musicians in a room and knowing that this is the take, because, you know, you can edit between takes and you change stuff, but there's a limit back then to what you could do. Mm-hmm. And now you can do anything. You can auto-tune, you can make it in time, you know, and I think that's partly what's killed that energy, which is why we all go back to these songs from the 50s, 60s, 70s.
So real.
And just go, wow, the energy on these records is amazing. It's because you got guys in a room creating that energy all at once, you know. I mean, I did an experiment way back in the 80s where we recorded a track with 5 guys in the room and captured a track. And then we recorded each individual part exactly the same, but individually. And it's a different record, if you know what I mean. I don't think you can beat having people working together and live and capturing something, because there's an energy and a kind of like, shit, you know, I can't mess this up. Everyone ups their game. Yeah. You know, those days with Robert Palmer, when we were working with kind of Little Feat or these mad bands that we put together, no one there, you know, if it's James Jamerson and Ed Green, you know, they're not going to be the ones that mess up, you know, so everyone ups their game. When you can do 100 takes of something, obviously it's not so important. Somebody can try something out, doesn't work, not a problem. We can cut and paste, you know. So it's just that, I think.
It's a great point. People need to be pushed to their limits to, like, people rise to the occasion, and what they think is an adverse or a negative environment actually can cause someone to excel. And I think a lot of those records back then had moments that were extraordinary on them because it was required for someone to step up, and they did.
It was, and we had so little technology. I mean, you know, we had desks that were manually operated. They had, you know, the old island desks were 10K top end, 50 hertz bass end, and 5 frequencies in the mid range, which were all click selected. You didn't have parametrics. So you had a very little EQ, very few outboard bits and pieces, a couple of compressors, a gate, an ADT machine. Obviously, once Abbey Road had come up with that for the Beatles, everyone else got one. A lot of the maintenance guys that I worked with, they were building their own units, so the guys would come in at Olympic and at Island and say, we've built this, see if you like it, and it would be a compressor or some kind of effect, but they were all one-offs. And for me, that was so exciting. And the other thing is, if you worked at Island, you got a different sound because it was Helios desks and so on, and the sound of the room. You went to Trident, different room, but a Trident desk. You went to Air, it was a Neve desk. Everywhere sounded different. And you went to studios to get a particular sound. But in the 80s, when SSL, covered the world, and now we all have Pro Tools where everyone's using the same plugins, it's a completely different world. That's why so many things sound so similar and so manufactured, because we can all do that now.
Yeah,
we couldn't put people in tune back then. It was either a great take, although out of tune, or it wasn't a great take. You couldn't change stuff, whereas now you can change everything. So that to me is one of the biggest changes.
Well, that's a great point. I wanted to ask you, let's talk drum sounds. I'd like to get down into the weeds. In other words, I'd like to take what's in your brain and put it into my brain permanently. When you're recording drums for Led Zeppelin, tell me what that drum setup looks like, mic-wise.
Well, I didn't record the drums for Zeppelin. I was doing all the guitars and the acoustics, vocals, flutes, things like that. But back then, we used very few mics. I mean, with Zeppelin, Bonham had just such a powerful, he did hit drums hard, The bass drum was just phenomenal, and it still is. You put on any Zeppelin record, and the bass drum is just stunning. And it's double skin, which wasn't part of the thing back then. In the 70s, it was all.
You mean front and back head?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s, we tended
no hole for the mic.
Well, we tended to use single skin in the 70s. So you just have the main skin for the beat.
Batter head, yeah.
No skin on the front. Tom's the same. So you could put mics inside the toms. So you got great tom sounds with less cymbal spill. But Zeppelin, it's probably 6 mics at the most. And I guess, I've been through the whole Miller. I've never really, my brother, Terry Brown, recorded Rush, many albums with Rush. And he was at Rockfield. And I went out there in the mid-70s, and he had this massive, great kit, obviously with the Rush guys, and probably 18 mics, and I was just blown away. I was just looking, going, wow, this is a great sound, but like, what a nightmare, And then he came to London when I was, a couple of weeks later, when I was working with Steve Winwood, and I had 5 mics on the drums, and he was the same. He went, wow, this sounds great. So it's just this whole different way of working.
Right. Most what that looks like. Like, what is it? Is it a set of 87s and a Fed up front?
Well,
I know you like the D20.
Yeah, I was a big fan of 87s. D12, D20 on the bass drum is brilliant.
Can you tell me what a D20? I know that I probably have come across them, but they're just not around. Is it a D12? Is it a low, like a lower focused microphone? Explain what it is.
The D12, D20, and D30 are all very similar. The D30 is basically 2 D12 capsules side by side. So Dave Gilmour uses the D30 for guitar amps. Mm-hmm. But basically, you just got 2 D12s really in a setup. So the D12 and D20 were very similar. I just love the D12. I still do. I think it's one of the best bass drum mics that you can get. Obviously, they're so old now. I used to have 3 of them, but they do, eventually break or become unrepairable. They were just a fantastic dynamic mic, and with Zeppelin, it wouldn't surprise me if it was like a D12 on the bass drum, you know, a 57 on the snare, but then just a couple of overheads. Because the one thing I do remember about Bonham is that if you ever tried to mic up the toms, he would just go, "You get them away from me." You know, he didn't want the toms mic'd up individually. So everything was kind of distant mic'd in a way.
Yeah.
And that's how you get that incredible size, that space. When they did a lot of the Zeppelin stuff, they worked at they used to take the Stones mobile and work at this house in the West Country, which had a kind of big entrance hall with a gallid, galleried.
Right. When the Levee Breaks was recorded there.
They'd put the 87s, above, looking down, maybe 15, 20 feet. So, I mean, all this size and space, it's not reverbs or in the box, because we didn't have that then. It is the sound of this room. Mm-hmm. With Talk on Spirit of Eden, we used a Neumann head, one of these head microphones where you put mics in the ears. That was our basic drum sound with a bass drum and a snare.
Right. There's something so beautiful about those sounds. It requires that the drummer, I find, it requires that the drummer has they have to be good, because they have to play the kit like a total instrument. You can't have them beating the shit out of the snare and not really hitting the tom, right? It requires that they sort of mix themselves. But if they can do that, that sound, I've found like an MS mic down in where it's mostly the cardioid down and a little bit of the MS in, it's like those kind of drum sounds with the drummer, that and a kick drum and maybe a little bit of snare, and you can really have something that's perfect.
If you're going to record with few mics, then you need a drummer who's got a very well-balanced kit and also plays right, So somebody like Lee Harris from Talk, who just has the most amazing kind of feel and spends weeks getting different toms and cymbals, everything to match the level.
Right.
It's not all from one kit.
Great point. Cymbals, right? They got to pick the right cymbals that aren't too bright so that you don't have this.
You have to be, if you're going to work with few mics, then it's down to the drummer, to be honest. And
so I don't want to forget. So the difference between a D12 and a D20. How would you explain that to me?
To be honest, I'm not too sure exactly what the difference is. It's the same capsule. I think on the D20 you have a bass lift, or there's a little dial on it that gives you.
But to your ear, do they sound exactly the same?
Pretty damn close.
Gotcha.
I do like the D12 because it is literally a fixed, it's a capsule with a fixed mic. You put it up, that's what you get. With the D20, you can change a few things on it. But the D12 I loved. D20 is great. D30 is just sublime, but very few of those seem to exist.
Can you tell us about you were talking about use like 6 mics in that setup with a D12, and like if you had 6 mics to put on a drum kit and you wanted to get like what you thought was just a beautiful rock sound, where would you put those? I know it would change depending on orchestration and whatnot, but
back in the 70s, it was, basically a D12 on the bass drum, snare, 57, couple of, I used a lot of 87s, couple of 87s underneath the toms because we had single skins, and a couple of overheads. That would be the setup. It wasn't.
What about room mics?
Back then in the 70s, I didn't use room mics too much, but we had rooms that I guess had a certain liveness to them. You got to remember that in the 60s, rooms were very live. Olympic One was a fantastically live room, and then as studios in the 70s developed, because of multi-track, 24-track, and one in separation, studios became deader. But Ireland, Studio One Ireland was, held 100 musicians. So it had a certain ambience to it.
And that crept its way into the close mics.
Yeah. And also, if you say, I spent most of my life recording with bands. So the leakage you got from the drums into other mics gave you the kind of size. So I didn't use many room mics back in the 70s. I used them on Talk, and I've used them ever since 1988, I suppose. I've always had room mics as well. So I would have my usual drum set up, and then I have a Sony C48, which I use as a room mic. And I love, you know, just room mics, room sounds. But if you find the right studio, you can actually use less mics because the room has the sound.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit like Ethan Johns, you know, who basically records the room rather than the instrument, if you know what I mean. So, you know, he spends a lot of time setting everyone up and then puts up a few mics, and he's basically recording what's in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a knack, you know, that's an art form. But
and I guess that the room mics are a luxury whenever you're dealing with track count. It's like, well, can we afford 2 extra mics and to put out on this tape machine?
I mean, it was, you know, back in the 70s, which is probably why I didn't do it too much. You know, you were kind of limited to 24 track.
Mm-hmm.
In the 80s, we ended up with 2 24s synced together, so you had 46 track. But then the 80s is a whole different world for me because it was all manufactured sound for most of it.
Mm-hmm.
With Talk, you know, we had 5 24 track machines slaved and a Mitsubishi 32 tracks. So, you know, we had 100 tracks of analog. So it didn't really matter. Although we were using one mic on instruments, but we just had hundreds of little segments of instruments.
Incredible.
That's how that whole thing was built up, you know. Since then, I mean, I love working in rooms that sound good. So Rack in Studio One or Studio Sono in Prague, rooms that just sound fantastic. You get a good drummer with a well-tuned kit in a great sounding room. You don't actually have to do too much.
That's a brilliant point. You know, we have these conversations deep on the internet and discussion groups about like all this stuff. But what really matters is great drummers, great drum kits, and then you have to really serve that and not mess it up, not screw it up.
I think Jacob Astorius said something about this, but it's just like, don't mess it up. You know, I mean, the thing, you know, from an engineering point of view, you can do so much, can't you? Especially today, but you don't have to do a lot. And I come from that era when we didn't have a lot to mess things up. So you kind of got sounds at source, mic'd it, you know, to get the best of what you were hearing when you stood in the room. I mean, I still, you know, up until I stopped working, I was still doing that. You know, if something doesn't sound right, instead of messing around with EQ for half an hour, I'd go into the room and find out what it sounded like in the room and adjust the mic or change the AC30 or you know, you get the sound at source and then, you know, put a mic on it that's the right kind of mic, but it's not that desperate, you know, in a relatively good position, and then don't mess it up. You know, it sounds simple, but it's much easier than people think now. You know, with Pro Tools, with all the plugins you have and all the options you have, it's a bit of a nightmare because you always think you should be doing something. Mm-hmm. But if it sounds great, leave it alone.
That's underrated what you're saying about going in. I was doing a seminar and I had the guys listening through the monitors and control room, and I went into the ISO booth and I took the guitar and it was probably just a 57, might have been a Royer, but I just went from the outside of the cone on the right side. And as he's playing, I moved it across. And as I moved it across the speaker, everybody in the control room, you could see their faces like I had just pulled a rabbit out of a hat. They were blown away at the difference in the sonic characteristic from the edge of the cone through to the center of the cone, the center of the driver, the center of the cone, out to the outside of that speaker. They just could not believe the difference in tone. And when you know that stuff, why would you go EQ it? You know, go out and move the mic.
But I think that's the secret, like I said, about getting it in, you know, the sound in the room. And I learned a huge amount, you know, I guess, working on the Torture records, because we were miking things at a distance, but we weren't using EQ. We weren't, you know, I wasn't allowed to use EQ or compression. So everything had to be done in the room. But it became amazing where you could move something an inch or two and it would just be a revelation. And if somebody told me that, I'd go, oh, yeah. You know what I mean? You don't believe that you move it an inch and it sounds different. It's like, yeah, what were you on? But when you're in that environment and you move something and it's like, wow, really?
Or change a mic.
Or change the mic. I mean,
unbelievable.
When we set up a lot of the Torture stuff, we'd put up 5 mics. You know, they were fairly random. They were like my preference, Tim Free Screen's preference. You know, it would all have a couple that we liked. We'd put them all up and then go, well, that's too bright. No, that's no good. and you slowly narrow it down to 2 mics, and then eventually go, that's the mic. And then you fine tune the sound in the room and the position of the mic. You know, that's why it took so long to make those records, because although there's only 6 songs and they took a year, most of it was in the setup. You know, it might take 5 days to get a guitar sound.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it's almost like you want to deliver a punch list for people. If you don't like the sound, go to the source and listen to it. Evaluate the room, the placement, the miking technique, the microphone, then go to the control room, think about the EQ. Not like go to the EQ. That would be helpful.
You know, I've been fortunate to work in great studios as well over the years. You know, a lot of them have disappeared now, but if you're working at, you know, whether it's Air or, you know, Rack or Island, or, you know, or Muscle Shoals, or, you know, you're working in great sounding room, then you have that facility to do that. If you're working at home in a home studio, you know, you've got this 12 by 15 box, which has limitations. So you probably need to do more with plugins to get what you want. But if you're in a great room, which is, you know, that whole era in the 70s was you went to the studio that you liked the sound of. So if you wanted a Trident sound, you went to Trident.
Yeah,
that's a good point. And you went to Island, you know. You wanted Air, you know, it was so like that then. And I miss that. I mean, that's the 60s and 70s for me were just the heydays, you know, of recording. The 80s, I had a great difficulty with all that overblown drums and keyboard brass and all that kind of stuff. It took me, I mean, I nearly left the business in 86. I'd had enough of the business by then, I suppose.
But you didn't.
Well, no.
Because it's impossible to leave the music business. We all know that.
I was really close. I mean, I'm not kidding. I was really close. I hadn't worked for 6 months. You know, I didn't really adapt to that whole early digital gear, which I didn't really like. And then I met the Talk guys, you know, which totally recreated my career.
All right, so I'm going back to our 6 mics on the drums. All right, so let's get specific. D112. Let's say the front head is off. Where does that live? Off to the 3 o'clock position, pointed in at the beater. Where does it live?
Well, when it was without the front skin, I mean, I just used to put it's a D12, not a D112.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, yes. No, the D112 is a very different mic to the D12.
You're right.
It's supposed to be, you know, the new version, but it's completely different. They've started bringing out a new version of the D12, which is actually quite a cool little mic. It's only been out for a year.
VR, right?
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, it's much more like the old D12s. But I used to put it slightly off center, angle-wise, but pretty much center of the bass drum, but at an angle. I'd very rarely mic things hard on like that. I tend to go at an angle.
How far from the center towards the side of the kick drum would that mic be? Halfway?
Pretty center and right on the outside rim of the bass drum. I've never really been into that thing of putting the mic in the bass drum. So
like where the number 3 would be on a clock, per se.
Yeah, more like number 2.
Number 2, and you tilt it a little bit towards.
Angled at like kind of 2 o'clock.
And how about if there was a drum head on there? Where would that change your location?
If there's no hole in it, then it would probably be a similar. I might bring it back a couple of inches from that skin. If it's got a hole in it, then you have to be careful, because if you mic the hole, you can get this air boost of air, which can shut the mic down a bit. So I've always done things at angle to try and avoid some of that. But I say in the 70s, that whole 70s drum sound was single skins. It's very easy getting drum sounds in the 70s.
Okay, so the one, we'll say, assuming one mic on the drum kit, on the kick, snare would be on the 57 traditional miking.
Yeah, I mean, originally I used to use this AKG 224, which I used for years, which is a thin silver pencil mic. It's used for vocals and all kinds of stuff, actually. I mean, Jagger used it on Simply for the Devil, but I used to use that as a snare drum for many, many years. It's quite
What is
bright.
that? AKG?
AKG 224.
Similar to a 451. What's it? I don't know that I know the 224.
No, I mean they're kind of not really around now. They were around in the 60s and 70s. I guess they're still around in some studios, but it just was crisper and brighter.
Mm-hmm.
So I used that for many, many years, and then I just slowly moved to the Shure 57 just because it's more directional. It doesn't suck in as much of the hi-hat, which the 224 always used to do. So for me, D12 on the bass drum, SM57 on the snare, and then I'm very open to the rest of it. I've used Coles, ribbon mics for overheads. I've used 87s a lot. I like 87s on toms, SM57s. I have no fixed thing on. Generally I don't have fixed mics and drums. I'll use whatever's around to a degree.
And what's your thought on the overheads? Do you mostly do space pairs or MS or XY or Blue Line pair?
Yeah, again, it depends on the kit and the drummer and how many cymbals he has. So I've done, the cardioid thing in the center.
Well, yeah.
I've done them coming from left and right. So they're just like, and lower down, so they're picking up more of the kit and less of the cymbals. I mean, I have, that's adjustable, to be honest, depending on the room, the drummer, the sound of the kit, and what you're after. I've also, a lot of the time, just used one overhead with the tom mics and the bass and snare mic, and not bothered about the stereo cymbal. So
wow, and are the toms panned still, or is everything mono at that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, because they're all going down as mono signals, so you can then pan it. You can either have the drum like we did in the 70s, extreme left and right, or, I mean, I do love kind of wide mono drums. So for the last probably 30 years, I've tended to have drums at the kind of 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock setup, so that they're more solid and in the middle. I'm not really into that, Phil Collins pan drums from left to right or whatever it is, because it came to mind that if your stereo is as big as the drum kit, then that's the size of your stereo. Whereas if you bring the drums in, then you've got a whole other world. So your stereo appears to be bigger, basically.
Yeah, you're kind of blowing my mind with that, because I get that, but I just kind of, my mind is locked into like, oh, wide overheads, wide left and right. And, I do bring them in on occasion, but like, I like what you're saying. It's making me think a little differently. Like, oh man, what if I just stuck really mono and just kind of had a little spot, and then my guitars would feel like they were out in left field.
Yeah.
I mean,
I sometimes do the overheads far left and right, but I'm more likely to do kind of 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock with the overheads, and then 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock with the toms and bass and snare in the middle. I like mono drums, I must admit, but I'm basically talking about a kind of wide mono. Then you've got all this space for guitars or whatever still there.
You got me thinking. You got me imagining some, other possibilities from that's what's great about these podcasts. We get to talk to all these guys, and it's like, oh man, what if I saw the world like that? What could I draw? Wouldn't that be interesting? So bass cabinets.
DI, but one of the best studio bass cabinets is the Ampeg Portaflex, which is a single kind of 15-inch speaker with the amp that, when you pack it away, it pops up. They're just fantastic for studio work. They're great anyway, but they're great in the studio because they're kind of under control. Having a big, Ampeg, massive, great rig is tough in the studio because the sound, you need to be a few feet away to get the best results from it. So if you're overdubbing and you can put an Ampeg, in the room and mic it 6 feet away, brilliant. But if it's, a lot of guys and you need to mic close, I think an Ampeg Portaflex is just brilliant.
And what kind of mic do you like on that?
That varies. I mean, I've used was like 84s, you know, the Neumann 84s.
Wow. I wouldn't have
yeah.
guessed an 84 on a bass cab. I guess it goes to my next question is like, are you using the direct signal as the foundation bottom and then the amped as the drive brightness, or are you using
probably
it
the other way around? I'm using majority of the sound is probably from the mic. I'm probably using 60-70% of the mic and then 30% of the DI. So the DI gives a bit of definition, but it's the kind of warmth and the size of the.
That's an important fact, right? So you use the DI to give maybe a little bit of face, so so it's more of the upper mid range or wherever.
And just use the mic. But I mean, again, I don't have fixed things on. I've used D12s on the bass amp, Neumann.
I'm surprised at the KM84 because I just didn't imagine the KM84 as, I don't know that I would imagine that. Think of to pull that out of a mic locker to put on a bass amp. I mean, it makes sense, but for me, I would think like, D12, RE20, even a 57 if you're getting high end off the bass. I mean, there's so many other of 409 maybe even. But
no, all of it. I mean, definitely D12, D20. If there's a D30, that's beautiful. But I kind of would go for all those. But if I was stuck with not having any of those, then there are other mics. Say it's not although I love mics, I'm quite happy to work with whatever's around.
Yeah, I've got to. Don't let me forget this question because I want to. After we go through this list, I want to ask you. Just remind me of the mic pre-question. Just remind me of that.
Okay.
All right, so on to guitars. And one more thing about the bass. That's another thing I wouldn't necessarily think to do is to put a microphone 6 feet away from like an SVT 410 cab. It makes total sense to me, but I wouldn't think to do that as an engineer.
The bass, the bass wave is long. You know what I mean? So you put it up close and you'll get a bass sound, and it's probably quite acceptable. But you move it back 6 feet and you'll be amazed at what happens. I mean, I learned a lot of this. I mean, admittedly, it's 30 years ago now, but I kind of relearned a lot of stuff through working with this band Talk because they had all this criteria of not using EQ or not using gear that was after 1968, or miking things from 6 feet. I mean, the drums on Laughing Stock are 28. The mic, one mic, is 28 feet away from the drums.
Oh my!
I mean, that's unheard of, Right. And it doesn't sound. If you go, when you get home, put on, Laughing Stock and check it out because it doesn't sound like it's 28 feet away. We were in a big room, held 80 musicians, but it was dead. So it doesn't sound like the drums are in a gymnasium. But I learned so much from working on those records. It's just like, actually, you can mic things from 6 feet, 8 feet.
I imagine it makes it much more listenable. Like it makes it easier to listen to because it's more like, hey, I stood 6 feet in front of his cabinet and I was listening to the bass player. I didn't have my ear up against the cone.
But one of the things, I mean, again, this is probably a lot to do with making those records, but I did do some of this in the 70s. I mean, the 80s is a bit of a tough decade for me, but if you're in a room with a bunch of guys and you stand in certain places, you do get a vibe, don't you? You hear it and go, wow, this sounds great just here. So my thing has always been, we'll put a mic here, you know what I mean? So when we were doing the drums, especially on the Laughing Stock record, we moved them around the room for a few days and then went, wow, if you stand here, it sounds great. So we just literally put a mic where we were standing, which happened to be 28 feet away. It turned out to cause massive problems for us because there was a delay, which we hadn't thought about. I mean, we were just going by, sounds great here. And then you've got to realize that, if it's cold and dry, there's a kind of 24 millisecond delay. And if it's warm and hot in there, it's 28, 30 millisecond delay. So we had to mic close mics to feed other people and the drummer because we couldn't use the mic we were actually recording. It became more and more involved. But it's that thing of moving around a room and going, wow, it sounds great here.
That's totally logical, right? I mean, it's like it makes so much sense, but as engineers, sometimes we have to get something done and we rely so much on like our muscle memory, it's like, well, what about if I just put if you're just starting as an engineer, be like, oh, I'll just put a mic here because it sounds good. And it actually does make sense. It's like, let's put the mic in the room where the thing sounds great.
It does, but you got to remember that, like, you know, right from the late 60s when I started engineering and all through the 70s and 80s, it was all about speed, isn't it? You know, it's like an engineer, you've got to get things up, get it together quite quick. You know, spending 4 hours on a drum sound is absurd, you know, so you get things up quick. But late 80s, working with Talk Talk, there was no time barrier. You know, we spent a year doing 6 songs. So I suddenly had all this freedom and with people that wanted to experiment. So suddenly you can actually walk around a room for an hour and go, wow, it sounds good here. Let's try this, you know, let's try that mic and experiment. But I hadn't had that experience until 87 in most of my career. Most of my career was getting sounds quickly, getting things, you know, sorted and on tape as quick as you could. We made records. I mean, I made singles, you know, recorded, overdubbed, mixed in a day. We made albums in 2 or 3 weeks. You know, it's completely different. The 80s is when that changed and it all became, you know, £100,000 budgets and let's take, you know, 6 weeks to make a record or 3 months or whatever. But, you know, as an engineer, it was all about working fast.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you don't get to, even as a successful engineer, like you still have roles. They're still saying, hey, work, get this done by now. We have to be through this by then. Or don't touch the EQs. No EQs allowed. Like, who tells an engineer that? It's like, well, it's the sort of
it's
the steering wheel out of the car.
Yeah, no, it's the only time it's ever happened to me when,
you know, what
my father said, you know, no, we don't want to use any EQ, you know, which makes you then have to think outside the box because you've got to use mics to get, if you want something brighter, you use a brighter mic, you know, or you get the sound in the room. You know, it's a completely different way of working. But I hadn't, you know, from 67 to 87, I hadn't had any of that, to be honest. And no one had ever said about, can't use this, can't use that, or, you know, let's try doing this. I did a few experimental albums with people like Brian Eno and Stomy Yamashita, but there was still not that kind of, you can't do this.
Right.
So to have somebody go, I don't want you to use any gear that's after 1968. It totally makes you rethink what you've been doing for the last 20 years, which is obviously what he wanted.
I kind of love that. I kind of love the idea that this is what we're doing today, you know?
Yeah.
Causes you to think differently.
Yeah.
And you get a different record, like you were talking track building versus just getting the band down at once. Yeah. Totally different result. So, I mean, I love the idea of that. It seems like, hey, let's get out of all the push-ups we do every day and let's actually do something interesting.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was like, for me in 87, it was like relearning all this stuff that I'd been taught back in the 60s with Keith Grant and Glyn Johns, Eddie Kramer, these people that were working on 4-track who were getting sounds in the room and putting drums and bass on a track and all that kind of, you know, mentality. It forced me to go back to, okay, so what were they doing back then? You know, so It was fantastic from an engineering point of view. It was just, you know, such freedom.
Right. Go ahead, Mike. You had a question?
I was just saying, you know, now that you've had experiences with both, with the, you know, having a long time to experiment and try different mics and, you know, versus that kind of capture the moment type thing, you know, record, mix in one day, is there, looking back, I mean, is there something that which one did you enjoy more? Or they just
I still love that. I mean, I did an album with Marty Pello, which is about to come out, but it was done like in 2019, but because of all the shit we've been going through, it got delayed. But we had an 8-piece band in a studio playing live, and it was so exciting and such fun. And I love that. I love being able to just play a desk and not worry about technology and just capture things. So I think if I'm forced to choose between the two, I would choose, you know, 5 musicians in a room any day, as opposed to the kind of, you know, one thing at a time constructing something. I'm not, you know, knocking the Talk stuff, because I think the success of Spirit of Eden is the fact that it feels like 5 guys in a room when it's all an illusion. You know, it's all notes one at a time, and things moved and offset with the machines, and it's all an illusion, but it feels like 5 guys in a room. But no, I loved manual mixing. When the SSLs came out in the 80s and we were all forced to work with computers, in a way I lost part of what I did, because that's not the way I naturally kind of function. I love manual mixing, and I love musicians in a room.
All right, so let's talk about some of the guitar mics. We'll use the Stairway to Heaven, since you said there was a lot of guitar work on that. Tell me what a guitar amp looks like when you're tracking Stairway to Heaven.
Right. I mean, I'm just trying to think back to exactly what amp it was, because I should know, but I must admit it was probably something like an AC30, but I'm not 100% sure. D12, my go-to mic, my go-to dynamic. 87 in the room or 67 as a kind of room mic. Island Studio 2 was a small room, a little bit deader than you kind of want it to be, so you could mic up the amp and have a room mic, get a bit of air. So I would say probably that. I don't remember.
So D12, let's say we're looking at a 112-inch speaker. How far off of the speaker are you, and where are you at?
I was still, even then, because, they were playing, AC30s are loud, aren't they? It's a powerful amp. I've never been into the thing of miking things very close. When I see, 57s right up against the cone, I know it can work, but I've never really been into that myself. So, my mics are always, that kind of distance away, 6-8 foot, yeah, and at an angle. Again, not straight on, but just slightly off cone.
So it'd be like kind of if you were to go directly on the cone and go off a little bit and point towards the cone, you'd be really close to that cone.
Or even being slightly on the outside and pointing to the center of the cone, but it's always at an angle. I've never mic'd anything just head on.
Okay, about a foot away. And that 87, how far out does it live?
Well, that can vary, but I mean, back then, probably at least 6 feet away, probably from the amp, because, let's say, the rooms were quite dead at Island, or the Studio 2 was. So if you want to get any form of ambience, you've got to be off, away. It's no good being like 2 feet away.
Right.
So probably about 6 feet away. Sometimes on cardioid, sometimes on all round, just depending on,
Right.
And
much. Where does that live? Like when you put that in on a mix, I know it would depend on how many other guitars, but it would be amp left, all the way left, ambience all the way right, or where would you let them live?
In the Cavalier days that we had then, being that we were on 16 track or 24 track, they would be mixed together as a sound. It would be, maybe 40%, 30% of the room mic and 60, 70% of the close mic, but it would be a sound. You
right on top of it.
Yeah, you could come up with the sound, check the phrasing, and that would be your mono signal.
And how many guitars are we talking about here on Stairway to Heaven? Was it like a bunch of stack stuff?
Well, he did a lot. The thing is that it was, it actually was, this was what, 72 or something, I don't know. But it was 2002 when I was working with Robert Plant that he actually explained how Jimmy Page worked on his solos, which would have been useful back in the 70s to know this. And he said that what Jimmy does is that he's basically experimenting. So he's recording stuff, ideas, dropping in, building up a solo. But then he gets all these ideas. He then goes away and learns it as a solo, and then comes and plays it as a solo. Mm-hmm. Well, no one told me that at the time as to what Jimmy was doing. And I was in that stage where we were constructing ideas, if you like, or dropping in on stuff, constructing a solo, which he would then go away, practice, and come back and do as a solo. So we didn't have the tracks to stack up loads and loads of guitar. We were basically working on the maximum of a couple of tracks, and we would drop it in all the time and then drop it out. He'd go, I love that, but get rid of those 4 bars. And we'd drop in, he'd play something, we'd drop out. That's why there was this pressure, because you know, of messing up when you've got.
It doesn't feel that way when you listen to that song.
No. Well, I mean, the thing is, I think what happened is that he then went away with all the bits that I'd recorded with him, learnt it as a guitar solo, and then played it as the solo. That's the difference.
Got it.
When I was with him, it was we would, you know, dropping in, dropping out, constructing ideas. I mean, it's close. I mean, I have a version of it. A lot of it's out of tune, sadly, but it's probably 70% of the solo is there. You know, when you listen to it, you can see, oh yeah, right, and that goes to this. But in this version, it doesn't. You know, it goes somewhere else. But you can kind of hear it and go, oh yeah.
You should send that to us right now. I feel like that would be great if you do that.
Well, I've always kept it pretty quiet because, say, a lot of it's not in tune. And
well, you know, no one listens to this podcast, so it's safe here. Just play it over the podcast right now. And did you do the acoustics? Any acoustic recording on that? Tell me about that.
Well, the main acoustic was already down, but I did all the flutes on the intro and an additional acoustic. And then mainly my job was the electrics. I worked on 2 tracks. I worked on Stairway to Heaven and Four Sticks. They were the 2 songs that I was really overdubbing on. The tracks had already been put down up in Studio 1 at Olympic, at Ireland, kind of the week or 2 before, with Andy Johns. So the drums were down, there was a guide vocal, and we did the flutes on the intro, bit of additional acoustic, but mainly the electrics for the solo. That was the main reason that we were.
Well, tell us a little bit about when you approach acoustic guitars, what's your go-to? I know you seem like a guy, it's like you've got maybe 10 different little shelves or drawers you open up and use drastically different methods depending on what you need to achieve. But let's say like a go-to, if someone walks in with an acoustic guitar, you know, give us like your primary, what your brain's thinking, I'm going to put on that guitar.
Acoustics are tricky. It depends if it's just a straight acoustic or if somebody's singing and playing at the same time, which I've had a few times with
Let's say straight acoustic, no vocal.
Straight acoustic. Well, right. I mean, there's a few options. Neumann 47, I like them. I like the ribbon. Is it not the Rhodes? I think you mentioned it earlier on.
The Royer?
Yeah.
122?
I've used the Royer on it. It just depends whether, whether you want it, brighter and springy or just something that's warmer.
Usually mono is what you're recording acoustics as?
I mean, I do sometimes put 2 mics up as, one pretty much over the, or, again, it's going to be, 6-8 inches away, but over the main kind of guitar hole and up towards the neck. I've done that a couple of times. But, for the last couple of years, I guess I've been using Neumann 47s and just, back recording the bulk of the body of the guitar. But again, I think pianos and acoustics, I think, are kind of the hardest things to record because, every acoustic sounds different. Every player who picks up the same acoustic is going to sound different, so that it's whatever works, to be honest. I mean, if you need to get up close and, close mic it with some directional dynamic, great. If you can pull back a bit and use a nice open kind of, I've even used this condenser, the C48 Sony, which doesn't work well. So I don't have a fixed thing on acoustics, to be honest. It can be a tricky instrument, but I'll use a kind of, most of the time it's a condenser or a dynamic, but I have used, ribbons and loved it.
Yeah.
And you put it up the next time and you don't like it. It's like,
that's so true.
It's a tricky one with acoustics.
And tell us, you're such say again, I'm sorry, you glitched out there.
No, I was just say pianos are the same. You know, piano is also incredibly difficult sometimes to record.
Right. So for a guy that is so holistic in his approach, I read that you've been in Pro Tools for the last little bit here. Like, tell me how a guy struts around in the Pro Tools world with your philosophy. Like, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? Are you learning to live with it and use it for what it's, how it aids you? Talk about that.
Yeah, we always have to kind of live with it, don't we? We have to live with the technology of the day. I suppose I hate Logic, Pro Tools, that whole in the box working with a mouse. I mean, that just is not really my world. So I can work with it. I don't enjoy it. I don't have the screen anywhere near me. I have the, I just, if I've got musicians, I want to be seeing the musicians. So I have the speakers, the musicians on the desk, If you ever come into the studio when I'm with Pro Tools, it's always off to the right, letting my assistant, worry about waveforms and whatever's going on. I'm just not interested in all that. I find it really addictive watching the waveforms. You start watching the sound as opposed to listening to it.
So true.
And so when people go, oh, it's a bit out of time there. Yeah, okay. Technically, when you look at it, it might be out of time, but you listen to it and it sounds fine. It's like if you took all those Motown records and put the bass and the bass drum and bass in time, it would be a completely different record. That's what people don't quite get with Pro Tools. They're too busy watching it.
That's huge, dude.
Yeah. And it's addictive. I mean, I've done it myself. I've got that's why I don't have a screen anywhere near me that I can easily see. I have to go off to the side to look at if I need to look at it. But my gut feeling is I don't really like the whole modern technology. I don't think you need 100 tracks. I don't like all the plugins because they don't sound like the originals anyway. I think we all do far too much tinkering and messing about with stuff when you don't really need to. And one thing you have to remember is that, I grew up on tape, and tape is this fantastic format because it compresses. So, the Zeppelin sound, we go back to that. We used to have a tape back in the 70s called LGR 30. It was yellow backed, very thick. And we used to set it up to +7 above kind of Ampex level. And then we'd push that another 3 dB. And the more volume that you put on the tape, it didn't distort, it just compressed. And you got this incredible tape saturation, which is really what Zeppelin is all about. It's that drum sound is just hitting the tape so hard and it compresses and gives you that sound. You can't actually get that sound on digital. That was my big disappointment in the 80s and especially in the 2000s when everything became digital, and especially in a computer box, you suddenly got rid of that wonderful natural compression. So now everyone compresses stuff, which you didn't have to do back then. I mean, when you recorded a voice, it would naturally compress a little. Percussion is a great example. I mean, Tim Free Screen from Talk guys, he doesn't believe you can record percussion digitally very well because the transients are so fast.
Right.
But on tape, a tambourine or a cowbell or something on tape, it immediately compresses and it has depth to it and it just sits there.
So true.
On digital, nothing ever sits, percussion, especially anything bright, it never sits where, the tambourine is always too loud. You know what I mean? It's just this. So in answer to your question, I mean, I don't like modern technology particularly, but in the last 20 years, obviously I've, got used to using it because we've had to.
Well, you can't find a good, reliable tape tech, tape machine, tape stock, that's like that has kind of used to be. It was an industry and now it's not.
Yeah, I know. No, the tape, especially when it all kind of died in the 90s, there was some brilliant tape around. So it's a pity. I mean, there are, new manufacturers that have come up with fairly good sounding tape. I wouldn't say it was as consistent.
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
I get.
Yeah.
I have wonderful. And you get.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a Studer two track machine, and I use the same tape stock, and just keep recording over it until the tape goes bad. But when I get new stock, I notice that you definitely have to realign your machine, and it's going to sound different.
I mean, it's always varied, I guess. The Scotch tape in the 80s was particularly bad because they used a different kind of glue with the back.
Shed, right?
Yeah, it would just fall apart. Whereas I've got tapes from the 70s, Bass F tapes, which still, when you bake them, still play.
Yeah.
And they've survived much better than the 80s tape.
Yeah.
There were some tapes in the 90s that were really good, but then it all pretty much, as you say, it went to the wall. But yeah, I guess I'm still, for me to get the ideal drum sound, I want tape.
I think this is what I was going to talk about earlier when I was talking about the mic free question. It's more of a statement. And through talking with you through this entire episode, thank you so much for being on. The one thing I can take away is we look back at all the records that you and your compadres made with such nostalgia. And we look at those records and worship every nuance of those records, purposeful or not. Mistakes become these glorious things that we could never repeat, and we celebrate them now, but we'd edit them out if we had them on our records. Yeah. But there was an environment. Right now, we sit in a room loaded with 500 series rack gear and mic pre's, and everybody's talking about, hey, this little boutique mic pre or this little new compressor. And at the end of the day, what I loved about all the guys, like I read that Jeff Emmerich book, the Beatles book, and what mic are we using? Well, we're going to use what mic's here. It's probably a 47. What mic pre are we using? What are you talking about? We're using the mic pre's that are in the console over there. Mm-hmm. That's what the mic pre's are. It wasn't this thing. Mm-hmm. It was just like, it was about making music. And it's like the holistic methodology when you're talking about these mics back. It all just really resonates with an overarching philosophy that music should be listenable. And it's not about, don't waste your brain cells on all the tiny little mic pre's and assortments of every piece of gear and every monitor that comes out and every plug-in. It's like, just put it through the mic pre and focus on the music. Really get the screen off to the side like you do.
No, you're spot on. I mean, it was, back then it was more about creating an atmosphere and capturing, the guys in the room. So you listen to Free or the Bob Marley, Bob Marley live at the Lyceum. I mean, if it was today and on Pro Tools, we'd get rid of the feedback, halfway through No Woman, No Cry, because we can, but, back then you had limited amount of technology and what you could do. So you just kind of went with the vibe and the atmosphere. That was more important. I mean, I say I'm not very technically minded because although I'm an engineer, I'm not a technician, if you know what I mean. I'm an engineer. So I have much more of an affiliation with musicians and soundscapes than how the thing works. I mean, at Island, and Olympic, we were fortunate to have 4 maintenance guys for 2 studios. So if something broke, one of these guys would fix it. You know what I mean? I didn't have to get in there and fix it. Whereas, the modern thing which has been going for kind of maybe 20 years, is because they got rid of all the maintenance guys first. Engineers had to start knowing how this desk worked and fix it. I don't know. I don't want to know how the desk works. I just want it to do what I hope it's going to do. So, it's a very different world. But
for all of us worshiping you and your colleagues for what you guys did, I think we need to seriously look at this conversation and say, all right, I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to start living like them. I'm going to make decisions. I don't have to have 120 tracks. Yeah. I'm going to have 1 track with the reverb and the source mic on it. That's my job, to make decisions. And it's like, do it in an organic way. Stop worrying about the gear and trying to find a magic bullet. Just get into being great and making the music.
Brilliant. Yeah. If you can do that, it's brilliant. I mean, it's definitely a mindset. And if you're kind of not trained, but comfortable in a certain world, it's very difficult to suddenly change all that. But I mean, the guy Rhett Davids, who recorded a lot of the Roxy Music stuff, he put vocals and the reverb and Brian Ferry's vocal would go down as a sound on 1 track.
Wow.
Listen, a massive collection of multi-tracks, you know. So I've got Hendrix and Beatles and all kinds of stuff. But you put up Sergeant Pepper and you listen to John Lennon, and the echo is on tape there. It's not something that was added in the mix, you know.
Right.
And if you go back again to this Phil Spector thing, it's like getting the sound and getting the vibe at source. So even if you've got, say, you have limit yourself to 24 tracks, or let's say 48 tracks, you know, if you want to be a little bit more relaxed, but you can still get a great sound up with a reverb or an effect and record it as that, you know, if to one track or to two tracks if you're nervous, you know.
Yeah.
But actually, because people always think, oh, that sounds great. Yeah, well, when we come to mix, we'll dial that up again. It's not always the same. I mean, this is right. The one thing I've found is that, you know, people ask me what mics I use. I mean, this was a running thing for a while with Dido, but I'd get phoned up by the manager or Dido saying, you know, we're in America, got a voice, can't get the voice sound. You know, what did you use? I'm happy to say what I used. You know, it was like a 67 or an 87 with a Euro 1176, you know, and I'd give all the information because I know that even for me, each day you go in, if you're using outboard gear, it's never quite the same. It depends how long it's been turned on, you know, is it hot? Has it been on for 6 hours? Has it been on for half an hour? It all changes.
Right.
So if you come up with something and you think, wow, that sounds great, put it down. You know, why bother to come? We'll do that later in the mix. It's just,
and you know, you're eventually going to put it down. Eventually, you're going to commit to two tracks, a left and a right.
Yeah.
So it's like, who cares? Some of the greatest parts of those records from that era, the mistakes or the overdone reverbs. Yeah. There's a reverb on, I think it's Rocky Mountain High by John Denver. That's so absurdly loud, you know, but it's like, I love that song because of that reverb, you know, or there's things where, you know, Led Zeppelin records where they're an eighth note off from each other, hitting downbeats, but it's just, I feel like I'm in the middle of that, standing in that space that they're recording it in. You know, I love it for that. So
no, I think we shouldn't worry about being perfection. You know, music is not about perfection. And I think that's why I've slowly drifted from it all, because I don't want to hear auto-tuned vocals, and I don't want everything to be metronomically in time. I just want it to be a great sounding record, you know, and if that means a bit of out of tuneness at times, you know, if we worried about, you know, how come Neil Young and Bob Dylan are so brilliant, you know, if we worried about tuning, the whole thing is kind of got out of hand where we're worried about perfection. What is perfection, you know? So I think you go for the vibe, the feel, the energy. That's what you need to capture.
Well, you know what else? Perfection is one thing. You know, failure is a million things, right? So if we do achieve perfection with tuning, it's exactly the same, right? So it's like the beauty is in the differences, you know, in the oddball, you know, lefts and rights, the human nature of it. It's really...
Everyone sounds the same, you know. If you use the same plugin and you use the same auto tune, everyone sounds the same. It's like, how boring is that, you know?
So on a side note, do you have a recording studio there, or was this your house we're looking at?
No, yeah, you're in my house. Yeah.
Beautiful. And this is, where are you at in England?
I live down in East Sussex. I've been here for nearly 50 years, actually. We bought this place in 71, and although we'd planned a couple of times to move, we've always stayed here. So I've recorded here with mobiles, recorded here. I don't have
looks like a studio.
Yeah, no, I don't have technically a studio. And although I had Pro Tools and all that kind of stuff on the computer, I don't really have that kind of stuff anymore. I don't really work much anymore, to be honest. I mean, I'm kind of retired, and since this whole madness of the last year has hit us all, you know, I will eventually get back into a studio with a few people that I love working with. But yeah, I mean, that's
the surefire way to get work, is to say you're retired or say you're quitting.
It's funny.
It's the only way gigs come to you.
It's true, because I mean, I technically kind of retired in, I think it was 2016. I kind of went, right, I'm out of this. Yeah. And within a week, I got Maxi Jazz from Faithers phone me up and say, I want to do
Yeah, you said you were getting out with in the 70s or 80s, and Talk Talk dragged you back in. So
I was getting out in 86, but that was more through necessity in a way rather than choice. It was just I hadn't worked for 6 months. You know, I'd become unemployable. In that sense, I didn't really like a lot of the 80s music or the technology. So I was about to leave. And, you know, Talk, you know, recreated my career, but also, I mean, I worked with Mark for 13 years, but the amount of work I've got off of Talk was kept me going for the last 30 years. You know,
isn't that amazing? You know, it's like you think you're in control of your destiny, and the reality is it's just you're living it. It is going to happen regardless of your
no idea from day to day what's
silly
really
plans, right? Yeah. Your silly plans aren't going to change it. So I'm glad that the gods have kept you in the music industry. And thank you, man. I'm a true fan of the art of recording and just everything. I think the genesis of the things that I connect with is the era that you're a part of, you know, and I appreciate the Patsy Clines and the Elvis Presleys, you know, but the stuff that really, I think where it kind of had its zenith was that era that you were a part of. And it's an honor to talk to you and have you on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Nope.
So Mike, were you going to say something?
Yeah. Man, Phill, I would love to do this on several episodes if you're up for it, man. There's so many records that I'm dying to talk to you about, the Bob Marley being one of them. But the Hendrix, I mean, I don't know if you're up for it, but man, this has been one of my favorite episodes we've ever had.
Oh, sure, really. I mean, you know, got my email, you know, get in touch and we can chat some more. I'm always up for that. I'm certainly not talking to many people these days.
Well, dude, they're dumb. I would love to get if I lived near you, I would be smoking a cigar and hanging on a porch with you every night if you'd let me.
Excellent.
Man, and we're so thankful for you being a part of that history and then coming on and giving, you know, a lot of people that watch this program never even saw Tape Machine. If they did, it's on their screen as a plugin. So, you know, we're really grateful that you come and let us.
They were it's a mad idea, but they are absolutely wonderful. And 16 track on 2-inch was the best sound. You know, that was 4-track, 1/2-inch, 8-track, 1-inch, 16.
I want to talk to you about Helios consoles, about tape stack heads, about different machines, Stevens or Studer, whatever you're using. We are going to have you back on. Is there any place that you want people to, you want to put out there? I know that you got the book, Are We Still Recording, which is available online. All you got to do is we'll put a link to it in our description.
Are We Still Rolling? Yeah.
Is there anything, is there a specific destination you want them to buy that from rather than just anywhere on the web?
No, I mean, I must admit, Amazon is probably the easiest. Like all the, you know, the publisher was Hal Leonard in LA, which was brilliant, but they've been bought out by somebody else. So to be honest, if somebody wants it, the best thing is to get it from Amazon. If they want a digital version, they can get it from me direct. But if they want a book, then Amazon.
Well, why don't you do this? Send me a link to the digital book, and that's what we'll promote down in our thing there. And people can find it on Amazon if they want on their own.
Cool.
I get the sense that you'd probably benefit more from that. Is there any other destinations URL wise or social media wise that you want people to visit yet?
No, I don't have much going on. You know, social thing. I have Facebook, friends.
I believe that.
No big social media thing. I have a website which is www.philbrown.net. But apart from that, no, I'm pretty.
Dude, I want to be you. I want to have like no Facebook and no Instagram, and just like, you know, no screens. I want less screens. That's what 2021 has taught me, or 2020 through 2021.
Yeah, no, less screens is good.
Well, I'm glad you're on my screen today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
It's been, simply, to use a British word, simply brilliant to have you on. You're an amazing dude, and I would love to have you back on. And I'd love to be able to dig in. Maybe we could dig into a specific thing that's very detailed about Talk, an album, or something about Hendrix, and we'll dig into like a single topic. And man, I'd love to have you on for as many of those as you're willing to be on for. So,
well, I mean, the Talk stuff, I guess, is always, you know, that's a longer story because the way that, you know, it was recorded and the amount of time it took and all the legal stuff that went on with the record companies, that's probably a bigger story. The Hendrix thing, All Along the Watchtower, was just a brilliant, like two-day event for me. putting the basic track down and doing overdub guitars. I must admit, on a 4-track machine. That's what I mean. These guys were on another planet. So for all the people that think you need 100 tracks of Pro Tools, all Along The Watchtower, drums on 1 track, bass on 1 track, acoustic guitar, double tracked, 4 tracks, mix them to another 4-track machine, overdub the electrics. That's how it was done then.
That's a whole episode right there. I would love to nitpick as much as you can remember from mic placements, logistics, and just the process of tracking and bouncing down. I'd love to hear that story.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much. That's it for us this week on the West Barn. Thanks for joining us. This is our 100th episode. Congratulations, Mike Shimshack.
Congratulations, Joe. Thank you, Phil.
Exciting to be a part of this, guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. Signing off from the West Barn.